Hey guys, and welcome back to Comics and Chill, where we are continuing the Millarworld retrospective. Now, what's interesting about all of the reviews from this point onwards is all of these comics were created after Millarworld's acquisition by Netflix. So a lot of these series were created directly for Netflix, and then we also have some sequels to older Millarworld books. I'll just cover this up top real quick, but any new series that was created for Netflix from here on out, all of the sort of production artwork and character design was already done in-house at Netflix, and then those designs would be given out to the artists who are actually drawing the comic book. So for example, The Magic Order, which is one book we'll be looking at today, a lot of the character designs were already done as part of a story bible which was created by Millar within Netflix, and whether they have their own artists in-house or they hire freelancers, I'm not entirely sure. But then those designs are given out to Oliver Coipel for him to create the comic book from, which is just something I thought would be worth pointing out here because, you know, I guess with what you would consider like indie or create-your-own comics, which I guess these aren't anymore, you know, usually the artist is creating all the designs from the ground up, but to come on board and just be given a bible and say, here, work from these, you know, that's seems like a kind of a unique situation, but I guess it's just like working for Marvel or DC, isn't it, where the characters and designs have already been established. Another thing that's interesting is that I found it really hard from this point onwards to find a lot of information or promo that went in depth on these series. A lot of the press releases felt quite fluffy, mainly just from Millar himself. I could find barely anything from the artists. Maybe I wasn't digging deep enough, and it was just easier to find news on the shows and movies that are going to be adapted from these comics for Netflix rather than articles about working on the comics themselves. I guess that's a bit more preamble than I'm used to doing at the beginning of these videos. Also, I'd just like to say, today we are playing catch-up and we're covering 6 series, as I'm determined to get all these videos out before Big Game issue 5 hits the stands. And today we'll be looking at The Magic Order, Prodigy, Shocky the Bounty Hunter, Space Bandits, Chrononauts, Future Shock, American Jesus the New Messiah, and Jupiter's Legacy, Requiem. So I'll waste no more of your time, let's dive right in. So first up we have The Magic Order. And the Magic Order is a group of 5 families of magicians who secretly protect the world from supernatural threats and have done so for thousands of years. Leonard Moonstone, the leader of the Order and patriarch of the severely dysfunctional Moonstone family, is considering stepping down, worrying which of his 3 children could take over his position, as one of them, Regan, is a hothead, the other, Cordelia, is an unreliable alcoholic, and the third and most eligible of his children, Gabriel, has already quit the Order to live a normal life. However, making this decision will have to wait as one by one members of the Order are being assassinated by an evil wizard clan looking to take over. So initially I was not interested in this book at all, although I love Oliver Coipel's art, but I do not give a hoot about magic. I'm not a Harry Potter fan or anything like that. I like fantasy, you know, like Lord of the Rings, that kind of stuff, but whether it's like magic spells and wizards and wands in our world, I'm just not really drawn to that kind of stuff. So I didn't pick this book up when it was initially coming out. And I couldn't have been more wrong in making that decision. I really enjoyed this book, and what sucked me in besides the incredible artwork by Coipel were the family dynamics that Millar had written. As I mentioned, the Moonstone family is quite dysfunctional, but to be honest with you, the whole Magic Order seems to be pretty dysfunctional, and the way that they all clash off each other is very interesting to me, especially amongst the Moonstone siblings. There's a little bit of rivalry amongst them, but also they're very supportive of one another. They each have complicated different relationships with their father, and the mother's not in the picture at all, which is another mystery in itself. And as they're all being picked off by these evil wizards, Regan and Cordelia trying to sort of coax their older brother Gabriel back to the Magic Order to help them because he is the best wizard amongst them was incredibly intriguing, especially when you learn the reason why he left the Magic Order. And although the story and the setup is pretty simple, I found it just built and built with each issue. I read the whole thing in one go, I couldn't put it down. And there's a nice twist that comes at the end that I didn't see coming. I do wish that maybe some of the side characters outside of the Moonstone family were kind of fleshed out a little bit more so we could care about them as horrible things happen to them. And you're kind of thrown into the deep end where this secret wizard world has just been going on for a long time. There's tons of characters, and you just kind of have to catch up with where they're at. At some point, it kind of reads a bit like a a sequel to something that we should have already read, but I have a feeling that's going to lead to more threads that will unravel in the later volumes, as there's actually 4 volumes of this, and I'm really glad about that. I'm very excited to read more. And just to touch on Oliver Coipel's art again, I've been a fan of his since I read House of M, the big Marvel crossover from like the mid-2000s, and his style is absolutely perfect for this. There's a softness to his line quality that really blends the magical elements in with our modern world. He marries them together brilliantly, and he also handles all of the, you know, the spells and special effects and gore perfectly. So, you know, I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. I was pleasantly surprised, and I cannot wait to read more. Okay, so next up we have Prodigy. Now, Prodigy follows Edison Crane, a genius scientist, composer, athlete, businessman, surgeon, chess player, stuntman, you name it. However, with a mind as brilliant as his, he needs to be constantly challenged. So when spacecrafts from a parallel Earth begin to randomly appear across our planet, the CIA comes a knocking, asking for Edison to help get to the bottom of things. And so a globe-trotting adventure ensues. And as for where this idea comes from, Millar told The Hollywood Reporter, "I wanted to write the smartest thing I've ever written, and at the same time top any action set pieces I've ever managed in the past. Edison Crane is by far the best character I've created in my career." And unfortunately for me, this book is none of those things. Whereas I quite enjoyed the nature of the mystery and the mashup of, you know, Indiana Jones, James Bond, Ethan Hunt from Mission Impossible, Batman, Iron Man, and Sherlock Holmes, Edison Crane, the main character of Prodigy, is an incredibly boring character to read. Intellectually, he is overpowered to a point where he has already thought of absolutely everything, and so he just breezes through every task in front of him unfazed, never really giving us the sense that he's in any real danger or that he has any faults or flaws or weaknesses to overcome. And also, you know, like with some other Millar books that I've covered, there's a lot more telling than showing in this one, and the character, well, he's just going to constantly tell you how smart he is. It's quite irritating. So this is a 6-issue miniseries, and all of the interesting stuff that pertains to the overarching mystery involving the parallel Earth is in issues 1 and 5, with issues 2 to 4 containing a lot of globe-trotting, smug action. Issue 5 is where the big info dump takes place, you know, a lot of exposition, which is a frustrating read, as I feel were these paragraphs decompressed and teased out over all 6 issues like little breadcrumbs, it would have been a far more captivating read. The very final issue is basically the villain and Edison going back and forth over how they've each outsmarted each other in kind of like a sort of, aha, but I already thought of that before you, and but actually I thought of it even before you. And it's pretty dopey, and it's far from the smartest thing that Millar's ever written. The artwork by Raphael Albuquerque is solid, but it's not as good as his more washy gestural style that he has on Huck. And to be honest, I would have just preferred another volume of Huck than this new project just to fill out some Netflix IP. And next up we have one that I was really looking forward to get to, Shocky the Bounty Hunter. Shocky is a balding, mustachioed, blue-collar intergalactic bounty hunter who is always pretty strapped for cash due to a mountain of gambling debt. However, when the biggest bounty of his life presents itself, he has to race against the clock to catch it before his rivals and peers do, all with a 10-year-old stowaway in tow. So the story is pretty straightforward, and I'm not going to give away any of that here, actually. I'll just let you go and read it. I'm definitely recommending this book. And one of the reasons I was really excited to read this was because I am a big fan of the artist Simone Bianchi. Since his days on Astonishing X-Men, I've loved his work. He always brings some very creative panel layouts to the game, where each page almost works as a poster or a killer sci-fi illustration, but he doesn't lose the storytelling either. He has like a great way of like contrasting curves with diagonal straight lines, and just seems like he's having a ton of fun with each page, employing a variety of media, both traditional and digital, with some images looking kind of more sketchy and like raw pencils with ink splatters and watercolor washes over them. It gives everything this really great, crunchy, sort of lived-in texture for this straightforward but wonderful Western sci-fi adventure. Sometimes he's using 3D models for Shocky's frequently appearing vehicles, like this space ice cream truck that he flies around in, but he hand draws over it, so it doesn't look too jarring, and the colours really help blend all this together. Some pages do look sketchier than others, and some traditional pages have digital fixes or effects just sort of slapped on top, but it is all like I said, it's really gelled together very well with a wonderfully vibrant color palette, and I had a lot of fun reading this book, and I would definitely read sequels. If I'm remembering correctly, it's either this book or Space Bandits that also, there's little hints that tie it into the Empress comic, which I reviewed in the last video, and Space Bandits also references Shocky as well, so it's this really fun, colourful little sci-fi world that Millar's got going here, and I hope that, you know, these comics are great, but it would be nice to see Netflix turn these into something special. And whether it's on more Shocky stories or not, I would definitely like to see Millar and Bianchi work together again. Okay, so next up, as I just touched on, we've got Space Bandits, and this is about two bandits, Cody and Athena, who both meet in the galaxy's toughest prison after being betrayed by the men that they work with. And so they decide to team up, and the first goal is to escape the prison, and the second is to hunt down their former colleagues one by one. Now again, like Shocky, the story is straightforward, but this book is incredibly entertaining. Millar was really in the zone right in this one. The character dynamics between Cody and Athena are really fun, with Cody being the brains and Athena being an absolute brawler that takes care of all the sort of muscle situations. And Matteo Scalera absolutely nails it with his fluid and sort of animated bouncy style. The colors are fantastic. I mean, I could waffle on about Matteo for a long time. I'm sure you all know who he is. If you don't know who he is, check him out. But he uses a lot of like heavy blacks, ink washes. Sometimes he goes with a no line technique. So his illustrations, his pinups that he shares online are fantastic, but also his storytelling is really dynamic. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. I know it's a bit cliched, but this book, it just moves. It moves really well. He has a way of using like speed lines where you can see the brush strokes, but sometimes it kind of looks like motion blur. It's brilliant. And I know I don't normally talk about the film and TV adaptations of Millar's work in these videos, but you know, considering this was made for Netflix, if you're listening, it would be an absolute crime if this was not made into an anime series for the platform. I know you've done it with Super Crooks. Just grab the same studio that made the cyberpunk anime for you and stick them on this. This has been one of my favorites that I've reviewed so far. Okay, so next up we got Cronas Future Shock. The story is, after making several successful journeys into the past, scientists Corbin Quinn and Danny Riley are still struggling with time traveling into the future. When their latest attempt fails, they discover that their math is not wrong, but that someone in the future is deliberately preventing them from traveling there. However, when they do finally make it to the future, they are greeted by a familiar face from their past who asks of them something awful for a greater good. Now, I had nearly forgotten that this second volume existed, and I do remember a few years back checking Comixology one new comic book day morning, as I used to do, and seeing this pop up with all 4 issues being released on the same day. And I initially assumed it was some sort of cock-up on Comixology's part, but I later found out that this was actually the release plan for this series. It was intentional. And my second assumption then was maybe all the issues needed to be dumped at once for some sort of tax reason or something like that. But in researching for this video, I did find an interview with Millar where he says that this was actually from Netflix's marketing guys, releasing a comic series that can be binged in one day, similar to a Netflix series. It did make me wonder why they wouldn't just release it as a graphic novel, and it also made me curious about how comic book stores would go about ordering this. Like, they'd have to order all the issues, I think, blindly and just hope that people buy all 4 of them. I haven't seen much mention of this series elsewhere, so I do wonder also if this release strategy caused the book to be quickly forgotten. And if anybody out there knows more about this, if you work at a comic book shop, I'd love to know more. Hit me up in the comments. But now onto the book itself. I did give volume 1 of this series a bit of a pasting in the last video, so you can probably guess that I actually was not in a hurry to read the second volume, with the only thing that piqued my interest was the new artist Eric Canete, who I've been a fan of for a while. So it may surprise you to hear that I actually really enjoyed this series. In a storytelling sense, it is just so much better than the original series. It actually focuses on plot and character rather than spectacle, having good pacing, an intriguing story, and actual character arcs, and it really nails the emotional beats that it sets up, unlike the first volume. And I can't believe that I'm about to say this to you all, you know, especially about a bloody Chrononaut sequel, but there's a scene at the end of this where I had to fight back, rolling a single tear down my cheek. The other thing that I really enjoyed about this book is that we actually get to see Corbin and Danny be heroes in this story too, whereas in the first volume, all they seemed to be fighting was their own idiocy. And Eric Canete's art is superb in this book. He has excellent control over composition, perspective, and uses a lot of strong shapes, but his line quality has this like great kinetic, scratchy quality to it that I really love. And I've been a fan of his ever since I've read this Iron Man book he did with Joe Casey in the mid-2000s, and so I was very happy to see his name on this book. And it's actually made me want to go and dig up some of his projects that I'm missing, and I definitely hope that he reteams with Millar in the near future. So, after 16 long years, we finally get a follow-up to 2003's Chosen in American Jesus, The New Messiah, and it has the same creative team of Millar and Peter Gross, and it's a tight 3 issues. It starts in New York in the 1970s with a virgin birth and a young couple who run away to Texas to raise their little baby girl, Catalina, the new Messiah, in a Christian cult-like compound to protect the child from Satan's forces on Earth. However, as 18 years go by, and after a lifetime of smothering by her parents and the others that live in the compound, Catalina doesn't believe in any of what she is being told and decides to run away and make a life of her own. And in terms of story, compared to the first volume, this one actually felt quite brief, and I think that comes down to how many main characters that there are. The first issue is completely dedicated to the Mary and Joseph of this story, who are named Luciana and Eddie, and issue 2 is a bit of a mix between Luciana, Eddie, and their now 18-year-old daughter, Catalina, and a few other people in the compound, and then issue 3 has more focus on Catalina after she has run away to live her own life. And issue 3 is where all of the interesting stuff is for me. I almost wish that issues 1 and 2 were compressed down to some sort of opening narration, and then the rest of the story focuses on Catalina trying to carve her own path and actually struggling with the idea that she may in fact be the second coming of Christ. But all of that is kind of rushed at the end, and it's by no means a bad comic. I think that just after such a long gap between the series, I had certain expectations for what a continuation would be, and whilst this didn't completely miss the mark, it does feel a little soft. As for the long wait, Millar said that he always intended to get to it sooner, but was putting it off or getting distracted finishing things like The Ultimates or Civil War, and originally Catalina would have been a guy, but as Peter Gross mentions, he's glad that after such a long time, in our current era, choosing a woman to be the second coming of Christ made more sense. Millar says he was thinking of a woman for a while, but it was the TV show's producer which sort of convinced him to go through with it. So I guess the sale to Netflix is what spurred on the production of these American Jesus sequels after a decade and a half. So in a similar vein to Cronas having all its issues dropped on one day, American Jesus, The New Messiah also had a kind of an interesting marketing strategy. In September of 2019, Millar announced a secret book that would be a Christmas gift to the readers from Millarworld, and that readers would not know what the book is, any details about it or the title, until they got to the comic book store in December to buy it. How that would work with stores being able to order it, I have no idea. Again, please let me know in the comments if you have more information. So a little bit more about the art on the series. On my first read through, I was a little bit bummed to see how sort of digital all of the work looked compared to the first volume's brush and ink and watercolour approach. Then I discovered through an interview with Peter Gross on Mark Millar's podcast that Gross had actually developed a severe tremor in his hand, which was seriously impeding his drawing abilities. And he had a couple of hand surgeries, he took a year off, he had to give up drawing on paper and switched over to working on a Wacom Cintiq with Clip Studio Pro, which has a stabilizing feature built into it which allows him to sort of minimize the effect of his tremor whilst drawing. I highly recommend checking out the interview for yourself where Peter goes into more depth on this. It's quite sad. You can see, this has really affected him, but I'm really happy for him having the Netflix deal, giving him the money to allow him to take time off and heal and eventually find a way to continue making art. However, I didn't realize this book had been released until the 3rd volume was already out, so I think after such a long wait I was just hoping to pick up right where we left off with the previous series, as the twist ending there was so intriguing, but thankfully I do not have to wait a decade and a half to read the next volume. I'm very excited to read it. Okay, so lastly we have Jupiter's Legacy, Requiem. And in this story, we take a big jump forward from where we last left these characters around 30 years into the future, where we see Chloe and Hutch struggle with their relationship and their children, who have now grown up and become superheroes themselves. Their eldest son, Jason, has grown up to become the new Utopian, taking over the mantle from his grandfather, and has become kind of obsessed with figuring out the mystery of the island that granted his relatives their powers way back in 1929. On top of this, several heroes are mysteriously losing their powers during battles and adventures, leading to their deaths as a big threat looms to swoop in and take over Earth. Now that's quite a lot, and I tried to summarise it as vaguely as possible, not to give away too many specifics of where each character has ended up at the end of this century-spanning epic, but I can say up front that I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and when it was initially released it had been nearly 5 years since the last issue of Jupiter's Legacy Volume 2 had been released, and again this kind of slipped my mind. I didn't realise this series had come out similar to the American Jesus sequels, and even though I'd love to see more Frank Whiteley, I was absolutely thrilled to see Tommy Lee Edwards' name on this book. Being a big fan of his work on things like Turf and Marvel 1985, and he uses a style in this book that I don't think I've seen before from him, leaning away from heavy black lines and into a vibrantly digital coloured style. Oftentimes he avoids line work completely, using strong coloured shapes to construct his backgrounds. With his perfect perspective, this leads to some really natural looking cityscapes and landscapes. It's beautiful stuff. Line work on the characters, but the backgrounds are just these strong shapes. At first glance, I was not sure of this style choice, but as I read the first issue, it just all really clicked into place. I got on board very quickly, as I felt it really helped sell this massive leap into the future that the story had taken. Edwards handled complete art chores as well, including colours. This is pretty mind-blowing, and I would love to find out how long a page of this was taking him and what his workflow was like on this book. There are a few other artists involved in this series, and the one that hits pretty hard is John Paul Leon, a close friend of Tommy Lee Edwards who tragically passed just a few months prior to the release of this first issue. He's one of my all-time favourite artists, and he provided the artwork for a flashback scene, and Mark Millar actually said that these were J.P. Leon's last interior pages, and the whole series is actually dedicated to his memory. Another pal of Edwards and Leon, Bernard Chang, contributed some pages to issue 4, with artist Matthew Dow Smith taking over pencils and inks for issues 5 and 6. And Smith's work is not bad at all, but it is a pretty big stylistic shift from what has come before this. Colorist Giovanna Nero does a great job with trying to match things up with what Tommy Lee Edwards was laying down, but Smith's chunky and scratchy ink lines override a lot of this, where Edwards' lines were just full color. As I mentioned, I don't want to give away the story here, but I was completely gripped through the whole thing, and I was pretty gutted to find out that it ends on something of a cliffhanger, with another series yet to come. I was under the impression going into this that this was the final series, but I'm guessing after whatever happens in Big Game issue 5, we'll be seeing a follow-up Jupiter's Legacy series, perhaps with all of these characters returning to the real world. So, which of these books do I recommend? Magic Order, definitely pick it up. Great story, great art. Prodigy, it had potential, but it seemed kind of rushed. To be honest with you, I would skip this one. Shocky the Bounty Hunter, I loved it. The story's simple, but I just loved how it looked, and it was a fun time. Your mileage may vary. Space Bandits, I think, is probably the most universally appealing book here. Fantastic art, really fun, well-paced story. Cronas Future Shock, it's kind of tough, to recommend this one. I do recommend it. I mean, I think it's good, but I think you'd probably have to suffer through Volume 1 for parts of it to make sense. American Jesus, the New Messiah, I do recommend it. It's a slow burn, but I'm looking forward to the finale of that series. And Jupiter's Legacy, Requiem, an absolute yes, pick it up. As for how all these tie into Big Game, we've already seen the Magic Order pop up. They've kind of got their hands tied. We've seen Edson Crane from Prodigy chipping in the early issues, and if you're reading that series, you all know what happened to him. Same with the Cronas. Shocky the Bounty Hunter, yet to make an appearance. Same with the Space Bandits and the Jupiter's Legacy crew. We've seen a hint of them, and I'm hoping that they come back in a really big way in Big Game issue 5, which I'm relieved to find out is a double issue. It's going to be a banger. I can't wait to see what comes after that series as well. But that's all I got for you today. Tune back in for the next video real soon, as I'm determined to finish these reviews before Big Game issue 5 comes out, which I believe is November 15th. And until next time, take care.